sector, not exactly the poorest of the poor, but who can afford a decent amount of money. So they're trying to create housing, and private sector will operate as an aggregator of housing. So this was the context. But though this is the context, but I'm sure what Bhuvna is going to address to us is the larger framework of larger housing situation in the country and the issues which emerges from there, and how does this policy situate there. So thank you so much, Bhuvna. Bhuvna is currently the professor.
Hello. Asim, you're cutting.
Dean academics at OPG, rather, I would say, put it like this. I
Yes,
started
I'm
my
a
public
dean.
policy job, and it claims, the Jindal school claims, I don't know, Bhuvna, whether it still claims or not, that is the first ever public policy school in India. So,
Yes.
yes, so that's
Yes.
how, so it was, and thank you so much, Bhuvna, for coming to this turn. Over to you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Haseem, and thanks for this opportunity to revisit research that I did long ago, 1999 to 2001. It's also in the start of my entry into urban research. We looked at rental housing policy in the context of low income housing. From that perspective, also, it was very interesting for me to look at the operational guidelines that Asim circulated. What I'm going to argue in this particular talk is that whilst it's important that we promote heterogeneous tenure forms, and within this larger heterogeneous tenure forms, rental housing constitutes an important tenure. The ways in which the current rental housing policy is formulated seems to suggest that it's an extension of earlier housing policy that favor corporate-led urban development. Specifically, one can argue, given the housing crisis and given the fact that the real estate is the largest defaulter in our current of our financial institutions, perhaps it makes one wonder whether this policy is to rescue large developers at the expense of poor among other groups in the city. I say this because the operational guidelines should be read in conjunction with the overall rental housing policies that is being circulated by the lobbyist. I am reading today's the operational guidelines in conjunction with a report that is prepared by Kothari and Company and Knight and Frank, and that gives you insight into particularly the ways in which the government of India is visualizing the production of rental housing. And that is where one sees a contradiction between their stated objective and what is likely to happen on the ground. Yeah? Rental housing policy, as all of you know, the 2015 one marks a shift in government of India's policy towards housing, which until then was particularly focusing on ownership housing. For a long time, there was an ideological opposition to rental housing. And there were several reasons. For one reason, that housing is seen as a welfare good. Okay? And extending ownership housing is part of a strategy to redistribute resources. And if you look at the ideology of the Dravidian parties, for example, in the state that I come from, ownership housing is a part of Dravidian ideology. They saw the redistribution of land, land for both small industries as well as housing, largely in the form of tenement construction as a way to redistribute and rebalance the tilt, the rebalance the inequality that we find in society. And within the Dravidian narrative, this is part of their strategy to redress caste inequality. It is within that the ownership housing debates, arguments were located. And of course, when you move on in 1995 with the Istanbul conference, both at the global level And within India, this idea of housing as a fundamental right came to fore. And this is something governments, whilst they acknowledge to different degrees, they have been finding it extremely difficult to fulfill. Now, even until 2015, 2012, 2011, when they started talking about private sector participation in housing, or take the Rajiv Awas Yojana, rental housing was never on the cards. Okay? And suddenly in 2015, it came up. Why so is the question. Yeah. One of the things, in order to understand this, I suggest it's important to look at what was really happening in the larger housing market. Before delving into this, the way this lecture is structured is having reminded us of the stated objectives of rental housing in the Policy Bill 2015, particularly with respect to low-income groups. The presentation will focus on what is new about the bill and also what has been the role of private players in the production of rental housing. And I am specifically focusing on the low-income housing market sector. Within that, I asked the question, who are the landlords and tenants and how and why do they produce rental housing? Then we look at how is the Government of India's new policy visualizing the production of rental housing and what are the implications of such an imagination. I take you to the National Rental Housing Policy, which is published in the NIUA website. And if you look at the definition, of course, it's a property occupied by someone other than the owner for which the tenant pays a mutually agreed rent. This is something that we have all been doing. We didn't need a 2015 policy to come and tell that rental housing is something that is needed and this is what renting means. It further goes on to state the target group of the rental housing are the destitute, homeless and disabled people. They also use social rental housing, affordable rental housing as a stopgap towards aspirant home buyers, and institutional rental housing for working class. Now, each of these is never explicated in detail within the rental housing policy. For example, if you take the social rental housing, if you take the European context from which this idea is traveled, it comes out of the argument that housing is largely for use value and it's not for exchange value. Okay, I presume that most of you are already well versed with the Marxian debate on value and the distinction that Marx makes between the use value and housing exchange value. And this is something that's dominated the housing debates within the urban development literature. Is access to house or housing, as we understood as a verb, is to derive exchange value.
Yeah. Bhuvna, I'm really sorry to intervene. Many of the students are from the first year. So if you can just briefly say about the use value.
Exactly. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Okay. The distinction that is made from use value and exchange value is for the following reasons. If you take house and if you take housing as a fundamental right, it's essentially one of our basic needs, okay? And we need it for our security, okay? But day-to-day security, I mean our physical security. It's also important for your stability because it connotes something that you're belonging, it's your space, okay? It's both from the physical security point of view and psychological security, and access to house is very critical. And every citizen in this country should have access to decent house, just like your ILO deployed on, they need access to decent livelihood for food and clothing, etc. Yeah. Now, from the use value perspective, the argument goes that you cannot benefit from the speculative value of housing, any house. Like when you're accessing a house, it is for living, it's for your present use. You cannot think of what is the future value that I can command on this house. Yeah. Exchange value pretty much refers to that. If I invest in this house today, what is that I can command? When I sell it, either in the short term or in the long term. Okay. So now, whilst this distinction that is made between use value and exchange value is is sometimes a bit contradictory, because each one of us invest in a house not only for our immediate living but for our future stability also. Nevertheless, the question happens, what is the profit that you're getting out of a house? To expand this further, if you take a developer, the developer's interest in investing a house is purely for making a profit. It's purely for speculating on the property. I invest X amount, but then I wait for the market to develop, or I play the market in such a way that the value increases and I tap from that increased value. Okay. Given the time, I'm not getting into how they tap the market and how they play the market. We can take it up in the discussion. Right? Now, vis-a-vis a developer, when you and I invest in a house, even though we see housing as our saving, as our long-term investment, our primary concern is also about being able to live in a safe place, being able to being able to have a secure place both physically and psychologically. That is how one can look at the use value and exchange value. Okay, now the social rental housing comes from this idea that it is primarily produced for use value. And the way that is produced in the Western countries, particularly the UK and the France, is that people form cooperatives. And the cooperative then get land under subsidy. The land can be allotted by the government at a subsidized rate. Okay? Now, members of the cooperative are allowed to live in that house. Okay? Where the cooperative will restrict is on exchange. Okay? It is not the same thing as Pagadi system that you see in the Bombay case. The exchange is allowed, but you cannot profit beyond a certain level. And the idea there is, in order to keep the housing price at a certain level, that it's affordable for the target group, namely the EWS and LIG. Whereas if you look at our own policy, it's quite unclear in which respect they are using this word social rental housing. Then they go on to say affordable rental housing for target groups. Again, affordability, such as migrant laborers, working women, students, etc. None of these terms are really explained, but if you read it with their strategy for producing this rental housing, it raises a number of questions which we will come into after looking at how do migrants actually live in cities and where do they rent and what is their interest in renting a house, etc. Looking at these questions, we will then come back and analyze how does the rental housing policy understand affordability of migrant laborers, working women and students, etc. Then it also says it's a stopgap arrangement for aspirant home buyers. Again, here, usually the model that is prevalent in the Western world is that you buy the flat as a co-owner with the developer, right? The developer still has a control over your property, and you keep paying rent to the developer. And at the end of the payment of your debt and capital, theoretically, you can own the flat. But if you look at the famous case that happened in the UK, in London, particularly in one of London's high-end real estate, foreclosures are very, very high. Foreclosure in the sense that often people at this level, when you're low income, when you're not dependent on a stable job, your ability to pay the rent regularly also get affected. If you enter into that situation for a certain number of months, then the developer can foreclose the agreement and take over the property. The property will automatically go to the developer. So there is that risk with this rental housing as a stopgap towards aspirant home buyers. Now, the problem with the rental housing policy, if you look at it, it's extremely vague. None of this is articulated. And therefore, if you look at the models that is prevalent in other countries, it makes you wonder whose affordability they are talking about and who are they targeting via this rental housing policy. Yeah. The one thing that from the stating all this, that they are going to target all the marginalized, the weak, economically weaker section, they then move on to expected outcomes, which talks about formalization of rental housing through regulatory and legal frameworks. Now, this particular outcome is coming out partly because of the experience with the Rent Control Act and the hesitation of, and Bombay is a classic example. Many landlords, the Rent Control Act prevented landlords from raising the rent. Okay? It also prevented landlords from vacating tenants who are not honoring their commitment. Now, it so happened that there are a lot of disputes that have ended up in the court because of the Rent Control Act. And the Rent Control Act also had another impact, that if you follow the Mumbai case, or you follow what happened in various metropolitan cities, landlords were not willing to invest in improvement. Consequently, the housing stock got deteriorated. So it is with this experience, one cannot, Rent Control Act was reneged, it was cancelled. Okay, now there is a gap in terms of regulatory and legal framework in managing the relationship between the landlords and the tenants, and this is primarily coming out of the backlog of cases on rental disputes. So now they are trying to formalize rental agreements. Okay, that is what the first one means. The second one talks about enhanced fund flows along with incentives for rental housing. Where is this fund flow going to come from? The coffers are dry. The public coffer is completely died, and they have to look at it for private sector. Now, what kind of private sector they are looking of? The third line gives you a clue into the type of private sector funding that they are thinking of. If you see, there is this residential REITs, a point that will come up. These are basically real estate investment trust. They are talking about companies. If you want to imagine what is a real estate investment trust, think of Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law. He made his entire money with residential REITs. And if you look at the story of Manhattan, it led to the ways in which this residential REIT companies operate. They precisely target the areas that are derelicted, where low-income population is dominating, and they buy the property, increase the property value using state investment, and then get rid of the poor low-income tenants and convert this property for a higher income group. In a sense, the REIT, together with the state policies, enabled private developers to push out low-income tenants and bring in the higher end market for their products. So the interest is clear. As a developer, I am not a philanthropist. My interest is to make surplus. And the way real estate surplus works, it's a speculation. It's a windfall or a no-no, right? And therefore, thus residential REITs raises the first question as to whose interest does it serve. Then it also talks about employee housing, which is, there are a lot of gaps in it. Okay, this is the stated view and expected outcome in the policy. Having done that, is it that we never had rental housing in this country? If you look around your own surroundings, you will see each one of us in our lifestyle, whether it's our parents or our grandparents, we have used renting as a way of meeting our needs. Everybody's dream is to own a house, right? Whether you're rich or poor or middle or. And how do middle class, middle income groups, lower middle income groups, and poorer groups make their realize their dream? Basically, they realize their dream through a combination of credit and savings. Okay, and within this combination of credit and savings, renting forms an important strategy. So if you look at all of us, we all rent. Our parents would have rented one floor and then they would live downstairs, or they would use rental income as a way of funding their retirement. Now, the issue is this, although the scale of renting is quite high, if you look at each of these cities, it is not counted in official books, in official registers. And if you read the Knight Frank and Kothari's report, they also acknowledge that there is no way we know we can know the scale of renting in Indian cities because it's all informal. So the idea of registration comes from the fact I need to know, I need to count what is the scale of renting so that I can have a sense of the market and I can target it. Yeah? So essentially, in the research that I was part of for the London School of Economics between 1998 to 2001, we looked at rental housing sector in two cities, in Bangalore and Surat. Since there was no official records available, we did a quick survey ward by ward. And what we did find out was that close to 2/3 of the lower income population and lower middle income population particularly depended on renting as a way to meet their needs. Yeah. And Bangalore, if you look at it, if you look at the way economy developed, it suddenly from 95 onwards, the kind of economic opportunities that were opening in the city were largely towards IT. At least the government invested all its efforts to ensure that the information technology industry and the information technology enabled services to flourish. So all your land policies and urban development policies was towards that. Okay? That brought in a lot of migrants. For the natives, for the Bangaloreans who had nothing but a small plot of land, the way to earn an income was through renting. So if you look at a lot of these, if you look at any neighborhood, and if you look at the pattern of housing development in Bangalore, for example, until 2001, 2002, it is largely production of housing by small players. Okay? And small players include plot owners, or you can have your small developers who enter into a partnership with a plot owner to build 2 or 3 floors. Okay? So largely it was the small and medium players who were kind of producing housing, and both for their own use and for renting. Okay? Now, you remember within this category, the category of who's a landlord and who's a tenant is extremely fluid. I may be a tenant in Bangalore and I may be a landlord in some other city as a migrant. As a migrant to Bangalore, I may rent a place in Bangalore, but back home in Bihar, I might have rented out my place. Okay. And is it only for middle income group? No. If you look at the poor migrants and you look at their strategies of how they manage their livelihood portfolio, they try to move their investments between rural and urban areas. And within this movement, between economic activities and between investment in building a small house, and the first thing they will do is buy or occupy a plot. They may initially put up a temporary structure, and then they will subdivide the temporary structure to rent it out of the poorest of the poor. If you go and observe in the squatter settlements, how different groups of poor access housing, either through renting or owning, you will find this category of who's a landlord and who's a tenant is extremely fluid. I am a landlord in one place and I'm a tenant in another place. Yeah, that's something you have to remember. I say this because the ideological opposition to landlords and tenants came from the fact that landlords were often seen as an exploitative group and therefore it has to be dissuaded. Okay. Now, whilst this is not explicitly stated in the rental housing policy, new rental housing policy, the promotion, the way this housing policy is promoted, it's largely focusing on institutional developers, that is large developers, and they do not open the field to small players like your plot owners, like your small developers. Yeah, and that is something, that is one of the key issue that one need to think through. Why so? Okay. And if you look at the second thing that this particular research, I was talking about the LSE research, what it did show, both the LSE research that I conducted with Professor Kumar of London School of Economics, and subsequently another research on urban poverty, governance, and in Bangalore, both these research, and together with Benjamin's research on Vishwas Nagar, showed that for a lot of these people to move up in their life economically or to stabilize their position within a particular economic sector, tenure forms become critical. And these tenure forms can be heterogeneous tenure forms is critical, and these tenure forms can take the place of land renting, house renting with various forms of permanent and semi-permanent material. You can also have one-room units that you find in this old neighborhoods of the city, and much of these type of developments are found in specific neighborhoods in cities. You can go to the old neighborhoods, and if you have been doing housing urban area, you will find majority of the city developed outside the formal process, formal land development process, i.e. the urban planning process. And then it also developed on different types of land settings. And it's useful to know this because one type of land setting is what is called the Gram Tana in Bangalore, which really translate into villages. If you come from Delhi, it is your urban villages, right? It's the development within these urban villages, and these urban villages get engulfed into the larger city. And then you have these private land subdivisions. Basically, a landowner decides to develop the land, takes the land from agriculture and move into other forms of development. Basically, he cuts the land into plots, and depending on his capacity, he might get various levels of permission. In other words, these private land subdivisions occupy a range of legal tenure positions with respect to law. They occupy varying degrees of compliance and non-compliance. Yeah. They are a gray tenure. They range between complete illegality to forms of semi-legality. The private land subdivision, the stretch that you find it. Now, these are the spaces where you also find rental housing at the scale of rental housing very high in most of the cities. Yeah. Okay. Now, before moving into it, I wanted to show. This is a slide that looks at Bangalore, and this is a slide that talks about which are the areas where the scale of renting is high, which I just explained. It is the old city neighborhoods, and it is the private land subdivision. It's because of the way Bangalore developed. There was a specific typology of housing which is called bandarans, which is like the courtyard houses. This is something similar to Charles in the context of Mumbai and Surat. And you also have urban villages which is subdivided, and you have various forms of rental unit that's coming. You also have land rental units. Yeah. Now, what is it with respect to the some of the key findings that is useful for us from this lecture, from this presentation point of view, is that rental housing forms an important part of the livelihood portfolio of urban poor. I already explained to you that landlords and tenants are a fluid category. Landlords are a heterogeneous group. So to understand why people enter into landlordism or into the production of rental housing, it's useful to look at how they use the rent money. What do they use the rent money for? Do they use it for meeting their basic needs, or are they using it to accumulate vast surplus? And in judging the rental housing policy, this is a critical criteria, and particularly the production, the ways in which the government of India visualizes the production of rental housing. A critical parameter is how is the profit, or how is the money that is generated out of rent going to be used, and by who is going to tap into this money becomes a critical question. Now, the first point on the rental housing as a livelihood strategy, I'd like to take you through the process of how low-income families consolidate their houses. Okay, as all of you know, they don't have money. They don't have money that they can put in at one time. Like all of us go to a bank and then get access to the credit and then invest everything in their houses. They have to strategize between their insecure cash flows, because their work, the work that they are involved in, whether it's construction or trade or domestic work, is precarious. There are times when they get money, there are times when they do not have work, and they have to strategize for not only meeting their needs, and if they've incurred a loan either for building their house or for major health expenses, they have to strategize to repay it. So what is very, very critical for poorer groups is the cash flow. How do they manage their cash flow in their life? Okay, it's pretty much, if you have managed with 5-6 credit cards in your lifetime, you will understand that managing the credit card is about how do you manage the cash flow between various debts. It's the same thing. The life of the poor in many a times, they are constantly rotating their cash between their debt and investment in asset and income from either their asset or their trade, and back into repaying the debt. Now, if this circulation of cash flow is disrupted, they can slip into poverty. Illness can push them way below where they are today, and all the hard work in coming out of the food poverty can be eroded in one day. An illness or a natural disaster, any of these unexpected shocks can affect their fortune. Now, it is within this context, you need to understand the ways in which they strategize their house construction and where rental housing fits into it. This figure shows the house that Sundarama built, and she is this old widow whom I met in one of the squatter settlement in Bangalore. And this particular case is articulated in the report on urban governance and poverty, co-authored with Solly Benjamin and published in 2001. If you are interested, I can circulate it later. Basically, this old couple, they squatted on a plot of 20 by 30 feet, and they lived in a thatch hut. They squatted this thing in 1983. 1989, when when there were more people coming into this squatter settlement, because there was no housing, they found some people who have already occupied. So another group comes in, thinking that it's useful to locate here because the chances of being evicted is less, because there's already a group that is there, that's staying there, and they have not been evicted. Some of them decide to rent, and particularly one of these young couple comes in and who do not have enough money to buy a plot. They prefer to rent, and they offer 25,000 rupees as a lease for 3 years. Using that lease, she basically subdivides the thatch house, and she rents one room. But she also consolidated her roof. In the sense, she changed the roof from thatch to asbestos sheet. Okay. Now, how did Sundarama and her tenant look at it? In an interview with this young couple, what they told me was the reason they would like to use lease is that it forces them to save. From their perspective, the lease is a way of saving. And how did they raise this 25,000 rupees lease money? They entered into a chit. If you all know that small savings that run in many of our business wards, many of our cities wards. In fact, that is one of the main ways in which a lot of our city's economy is funded. Although we, again, like this informal housing, we do not have much account for it. Anyway, and they enter into a chit circuit, a small savings circuit. They pay for 3 months and then take the chit earlier, and they used it as gave the lease and paid the lease to Sundarama. Now, their idea is the chit circuit itself will be over in 10 months or 12 months, and that will give them an additional 1 or 2 years, even if they err on the chit, or if they go on a lower level chit. Maximum they can repay the chit in small amounts over 2 years or 2.5 years. But this 25,000 rupees that they paid will be like a interest-free loan that they are getting out of the chit. The calculations are complex, so I'm not getting to get into it, but they use, the perception is that the lease forces them compulsorily to save, and it's possible for them to kind of work out the balance with the economy. Yeah. From that, while for Sundarama, this is an interest-free loan. She could use it to upgrade her house. Nobody is going to rent her 25,000 with an old husband who's not going to work, and she was dependent on domestic work, which was just enough for her food. And from the lease, she moved into 1991. Her rich relatives from the village moved to the city, and they gave her another 30,000, 60,000, and they wanted to rent a room. If you go to Bogle in Delhi, and if you trace the story of how Bogle housing got transformed, it's largely through this. A migrant comes into the house, the migrant had to be accommodated. So the relative extends a room, okay? And for the extension of the room, the relative helps, okay? Either through loan that is sourced back in the village or through their savings in the form of fees. So Sundarama too built. Now she upgrades her house from sheet to RCC, and she adds 2 more rooms, okay? The cost, however, exceeded the initial budget. She hoped to finish it by 60,000. Then she had to borrow another 40,000, which she got it from a private financiers. And she did it with several players in order to fund the construction. And the construction was done incrementally, like the roof was not complete in one time. So you start with a brick roof with a a brick wall and a thatch roof, and then you can slowly convert the thatch roof into a permanent RCC roof. So that incremental consolidation allowed her to transform her house from a thatch hut to RCC unit, all 4 rooms on the ground floor between 1983 and 1991. Again, she repeats the same thing of lease and rent. And by 1999, when I interviewed her, she had already got the 2-floor units, and there were about 8 rooms, 7 of which was rented. By now, her husband is dead. She couldn't work, and her main income was largely coming from this rental unit. Now, in between, there was this NGO scheme which allowed her to access toilet. So now all the 6 rooms were dependent on that one toilet in that room. Coming back to the question, is Sundarama an exploitative landlord? Should landlordism be promoted? If you look at Sundarama's case, illustrated how lower income groups use renting as a pathway to consolidate their economic status. They're basically stabilizing their situation. They are ensuring that they have a steady flow of cash. Right? And not everybody, people like Sundarama, all of them cannot get into private finance, because that is totally another ball game. Majority of people enter into rental housing based on the assumption that it will give them a steady flow of income, because their jobs are so precarious. Now, if you look at the use of rent, the landlords themselves, if you can see the Sundarama's case, who are in a trajectory of moving from a thatch hut to the RCC thing, she went through different stages. as a owner of a thatched hut, the rent that she secures is mainly for her subsistence. It was needed for meeting her food expenses. Okay. Now, once she increased the renting to 2 or 3 housing, don't forget they are using the rent money to repay their loans. Okay, so it's not that all the rent money is going into saving. They may get a very small surplus, which will allow them to stabilize. They may either invest it in business or they may try and add on one more room. Okay, but in all of these, surplus accumulation is extremely minimal, if at all there is there. The last stage is surplus accumulation. If you look at large landlords, if you look at a classic example, is the huge chawls is the large chawls that you find in Surat, you find in Ahmedabad, you also find in Mumbai, in some places. These are like 50, 60 rooms that are being rented out. The landowner owns a large tract of land, yeah, and is able to build that scale of rooms for renting. And then the money that you're getting out of renting is much more than subsistence or trying to find an alternative livelihood portfolio. It gets into the realm of surplus accumulation. Now, the rental housing strategy with the large developers pretty much is falling into this category of surplus accumulation, and it's also raising the question of how much surplus. What is the scale of the surplus that they are likely to raise? Yeah. Second question, leading on to looking at landlords and tenants. The second question is, how do these landlords and tenants mobilize resources? In Sundarama's case, as you saw, it's a combination of lease money, combination of private finance, and sometimes they also borrow from their relatives. Okay? It's largely through their various social networks. And then they enter into these various forms of savings, the chit. Whether chit, you can call it, it serves as a double thing. It's a saving as well as it's a source of getting your quick money. It's a form of it's a form of a credit that you can access in order to fulfill your needs. Okay? This is how low-income families try and do their consolidate their house. Now, if you look at the young couple who were Sundarama's tenants, for them, lease allowed them to move off the tenure. Okay? And if you speak to construction workers, and one of the major group that enter into renting in these squatter settlements or in the resettlement colonies where they were able to, the old forms of resettlement colonies where the allotment was plots and not this huge tenement housing. The reason that they all enter into housing is that construction work is extremely precarious. Most of them can get income, can get a job for 15 to 20 days on a good season, and 4 months in a year they have no income. Okay. And that is something they have to manage, right? They have to manage their food, they have to manage their loans that they have got into during the lean season. For them, rental income stabilizes their position. Okay, and also construction industry itself doesn't guarantee you a job. If you look at the inflections within the construction industry, from the developers who are interested in cutting the wage that you give to construction labor, because you can't, how do you earn surplus out of housing project, for example? In a housing project, what do I need to build a house? I need land, I need construction materials, I need construction technology, and I need labor, and I also need finance. Now, to mobilize all of this. Now, land in cities, I can't do anything about it. Prices are high. There's only so much one can bargain the land. And usually developers try to bank the land much ahead of the city's development. And then they try to reap the benefit out of the city's growth, right? Sundarama's case is not like that. The construction workers that you see here are not people who have the land, who hold on to their land for speculative purpose for years. Rather, they occupy the land and they are trying to consolidate their landscape. land tenure and housing tenure through incremental development. So, okay, for a developer, land cost is impossible. Then you cannot do anything with it. And second, look at your material cost. There also you can't do anything. The market dictates. Technology. You can choose between a high-end technology or a low-end technology, but you cannot cut the cost. Where you can cut the cost is largely in the labor. This is something, if you read Marxism, they'll tell you the class antagonism between the capital and the labor, where the capital is constantly trying to eat into the wages of the labor. Now, the way they do keep the wages suppressed in the construction industry is by bringing migrants. So, for example, in Bangalore, at one time, Tamil migrants who moved into the city in the 70s and 80s had a field day till 90s. They were able to get many opportunities. And so income was fairly steady. If you go into any squatter settlement, slightly regularized, legalized squatter settlement, you find that construction workers dominate in that settlement. And they would have also invested in improving the houses. They will be the landlords in that particular settlement. But come 1995, they all lost their opportunities. Why did they lose their opportunities? Because developers started bringing in new migrants. Yeah. So there is always this wave of migrants coming into the city who are, in a sense, helping the capital to suppress the wage, which means for the earlier generation of migrants who are in construction work, your opportunities are not steady both in the short term and in the long term. And that is where they are very keen to find an alternative housing, alternative source of income where rental income fit within their strategy. Similarly, for traders need continuous access to money, because how do you finance your business? You need circulation, you need rotation capital, right? And if you need rotation capital, whatever you earn, the calculation is that if I have a business and I have a home to manage, whatever little surplus that I make out of my business, if I take part of the surplus and put it into my home, then I have the cash that I have to expand my business is curtailed. Now, anything can happen that will force me to take more loan, and that then I get into the cycle of returning my debt. Sometimes you're trading, it's okay if you have a good time in trading, you can return your debt, you can strategize in such a way that you can manage your debt and surplus and try and expand your trade. But life is not always like that. Traders have their ups and downs. Now, again, they saw renting as a way of stabilizing their situation. So if you speak to lower income group and lower middle income group, the scale of renting is small. They are not talking about a 60-room renting. They are not talking about the real estate investment trust, Manhattan buildings. Yeah. They are talking about 1 room, 2 rooms, which can help them to consolidate. Yeah. But this is possible also because in the older housing policy, they were allotted land. They were allotted a small piece of land. And they were able to get this small piece of land either by occupying a place in a squatter settlement or even in a resettlement colony. If you ever happen to go to Delhi and if you go and see the earlier generation of resettlement colony, the plots were allotted and there were minimum size for these plots to plots that can be allotted. Yeah. Now, what is this? The plot allow you to develop over time. And therefore, it not only stabilizes your position through renting, but if you are in a squatter settlement, one of the fundamental issue is that land. Remember, land is critical here, and that is where the contestation comes in between the state and the lower income groups, whether one should regularize the land status within the city. A point that we come to. If that was if I said in Bangalore, whether it's the lower income group or the lower and middle income group, were able to enter into rental housing because of plotted development. Yeah, and that the income from rent was important for them for meeting their needs and not so much to accumulate only surplus. Now, this situation changed when the housing policy underwent a change in 1999. And that is when cities started talking about globalization. They said every city has to become the next New York and Singapore and next New York and Singapore. And then they also talked about cities have to mimic the physical image of New York. So you can't have this plotted development. That was also, you also had economic arguments backing it, saying, no, 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 you can't have land values are so high. You can't have this density, low density cities. We need to have high density development. And come with this argument on high density development are the large developers. So what you see from 2000 and particularly towards end of 1999 and which peaked from 2005 onwards, you could take city after city. You have 5 large developers dominating housing production in cities. And for developers, the interest, as I said before, you look at the picture which is on top. It's called the PS Temple Green Vidyashram. If you look at that complex, that is a housing complex, come commercial, come a school. Vidyashram is a school located on a land of 120 acres in one of the peripheries of Chennai, which is called Sriperumbudur. And Sriperumbudur was imagined as India's Shenzhen because it is here it's here more the automobile engineering special economic zones were located, and you saw a lot of FDI flowing in supposedly for automobile industry. So the argument then went that we want to have foreign direct investment into housing. Okay, before that, if we want to develop housing to meet the demands in this country, we can't, it's not enough that we rely on local capital. We need foreign direct investment. Now, foreign direct investors will be attracted to invest in this place only if we have a particular type of development, which is largely townships and largely high-rise development, targeted towards either your expats or your upper income groups. Okay. Now, there was no talk of plotted development. There's no idea. Now, the idea that housing is a melted good and everybody must have a share of the piece of land that's managed, even in the token speech is also gone by this time. There was all this talk about FDI is going to flow into real estate, and therefore we have to promote these large developers. And an outcome of that is what you see in the picture above, right? I show this because there are in this Sriperumbudur, almost all the land, as I told you, every city comes because of the urbanization of agricultural land. Okay, and agricultural land belongs to the village. Come to the picture, which is down. This was once the village whose agricultural land was transformed into this temple green picture that you see above. Now, most of this, if you come to the second picture, who are the people who own the agricultural land? Sriperumbudur is a dry agricultural belt, right? And most of them were medium farmers. Maximum they had was 5 acres. And you can see a shed-like thing, right? That's another form of rental housing that developed there. They are people who had less than an acre or 1 to 2 acre. So in each of these villages, you could go and do a survey. You would find hardly that there were 2 or 3 large landlords and who own 15 acres or more and who have already moved out of this village into Chennai. Okay? So largely they were absentee landlords, and in any case they were interested in pushing for real estate, selling their land to high-end real estate developers. Now, what about these small and medium farmers? Their land was acquired in order to accommodate both the special economic zones and to allocate land for housing for large developers like the Arun XLO and other. You have your Hiranandani also operating in this area. What do? You, as you know, this argument that when I just take your land, I'll give you compensation. Compensation is really difficult to get, one. And number two, how do you estimate the compensation? What is the value of land on which you depend on your livelihood? How can you estimate what will be my livelihood? What is the income that I need to meet my needs over the year? Or how can you estimate that I have got the market fair share of the surplus that is accumulated within this, that is captured within the land that you're taking away from me? These are very difficult questions to answer. Nevertheless, for many of them, the compensation that they got was just enough to build their house again. So if you see this house where I'm pointing my finger, this has about 4 rooms, okay? And all of these are rented out to migrants. Why migrants? Although this particular village have youth who are educated and who went into undergraduation, none of them could find a job in the economic industries that came up in the special economic zone. Most of these automobile industry, they ask migrants to come in, okay? And these migrants are brought into the city through a contractor, okay? The contractor also finds them a rental income. So for a lot of these small and medium farmers, the only way that they can earn an income today is through renting. And if you look at the picture from the other side, the migrants come as single migrants into the city and they are interested in sharing. They are not interested in spending much of their income on renting because it's their interest is to maximize, save as much as they can and send it back home. Because that's how they can strategize to move out of their existing condition. Now, what used to happen is 4 to 5 or sometimes 6 to 8 migrants used to live in a house, in a room of 10 by 10 feet. They used to share the toilets. And if you look at in the cities like Surat, migrants used to rent rooms on shifts. Depending on their work shift, they used to alternate. They used to alternatively use the room. Now, much of these needs for housing for migrants, whether they needed a thatched house, a thatched roof, where they have to spend the minimum, or someone might be willing to spend a little more and want a little more comfort. The various range of products, rental housing products, to accommodate the migrants, were provided in are still being provided in many of these peripheries, which are located close to industries, by small landlords. Okay? Small landlords, and they who often enter into renting for earning an income. Yeah, but the housing policy, the reason I told you the housing policy do not invisibilizes them. They do not exist in the new rental housing policy. Also, the imagination of housing development, whether it is for ownership or renting, is very much this five large developers in the city. And this photograph is again taken from Sri Perambudur, and behind you see this huge tower, which is Hiranandani Tower. Okay? Hiranandani is one of the major developers for Mumbai, and he was also caught in an FPI controversy in 2013-14, and which led to HSBC winding up its banking operation in India. Okay, that is the FBI story of the large developers. Now, next to it, you see the village, and the villages are developing. You can see place to stay. Okay, all of these are one rooms, which the houses are getting redeveloped in order to accommodate migrants with different levels of affordability. So basically, at one level, you talk about rental housing policy or housing policy, but you squeeze the low income groups who can actually also contribute to generating a broader range of products in a narrow space of land. You've taken away the land for large developers for their large housing projects or for forming their land banks in order to benefit and accumulate a larger surplus. So that if you look at the first argument is this: by way of structuring the land access in a way that large developers benefit, that first of all, the rental housing policy is geared towards benefiting their accumulation process. To what extent they are going to benefit the migrants, the destitutes, and the homeless remains a question. Yeah, first. And why would they enter into housing? Where is this idea of getting large developers to accelerate the rental housing production to accommodate the migrants coming from? Yes, like Asim told, this idea was floating. It was floating from 2012 onwards. Okay, 2015 they came up with the policy. In 2019, if you go back and you see the newspaper reports, Government of India had shelved its plan for rental housing. Nothing moved. At that time, till that time, developers were not interested in even touching it. Developers were interested in rental housing policy because I read this quote from the report of Knight and Frank, where they say that this tells why they were interested in rental housing thing. India's real estate market is expected to touch a market size of USD $1 trillion by 2030 and start contributing 13% to the to the gross domestic product. Now, the reason why they wanted real estate rental housing, entry into rental housing, and particularly institutional rental housing, is because they see a gap. They see a gap in terms of the ownership status, and this is again coming from the underestimates that is available within the various property registers. Yeah. The main aim is to tap the market. And how do you tap the market? It's simply not by producing housing, but also by way of linking the production of housing to a financial market. So by linking the production of housing to the equity market and the debt market, and therefore the surplus is not going to come simply by producing a unit and donating it to and allowing the migrants to settle there. And this was an initial interest in which a lot of these lobbies went for rental housing policy. At the same time, the government of India, whether it's the state government, regional governments, or the central government, they were allergic to redistribute land through regularization, regularizing your squatter settlements or regularizing your private land subdivision. And you would have the politics of regularization is another topic to look at. But take the case of Kaputli colony, which was supposed to give titling to the squatter dwellers under the Rajiv Awas Yojana. The whole thing, the whole scheme, if you really analyze it, it was couched as a transfer of development, favored and it advantaged a large developer, namely the Rakeja builders. Today, the Rajiv and the residents of Kaputli colony who were evicted out of their earlier land, the promise was you will be given title to this land. But today they are thrown out of that land. Some of them are languishing in the transit colony, and some of them are being pushed to Bhavana. So if you look at it, the tendency to use policy as a route to transfer land for large developers and for high-end real estate is a reality in this country. And the rental housing also fits within this larger reality. Now, why did the developers were interested? Particularly, if you look at the case after 2008, because I think Asim is back and the time is up, so I'm running through. What also happened is that many of these markets, many of these large developers could not sell their houses. There are enough vacant properties that is available in the market. In the Knight's own report, it gives a list of how many properties are lying vacant. And that is also contributing to the bad real estate portfolio, the non-performing assets of our financing institution. So one has to see that it is this idea which came out of a developer in Sriperambur in Oregon, particularly InnoGlobal, whose name is listed in the first one. This is a corporate developer who's from Amsterdam, who's from Holland. And they supposedly brought in foreign direct investment from outside, which is used as a capital to raise collateral from the local banks. Okay, they also are listed in Nifty from where they raise their money. So the game they play between land, housing, and whether it's ownership housing and rental housing is far more complex than what meets the eye. Now, InnoGlobal, when it could not sell its houses, what they did decide, these are houses initially, as I said, was built for higher income residents. They came up with this idea of let us rework these housing units and let's retrofit it for lower income groups. Okay, but their idea of lower income group was someone who's earning a stable income of 25,000 rupees per month, and consequently, none of these products sold. Those units remain vacant, and if you go back to the operational guidelines that was circulated, perhaps Asim would have circulated to you, is that is very much about talking about retrofitting. It talks about land is available with the developer, land is available with the government, it's available with the cooperatives. There are also vacant, there are also built units which can be retrofitted and remodeled. See, everything, a developer makes money from land. He makes a skilling from land. There is no way he's going to, any developer is going to be willing to retrofit their units to a market that the rental housing policy is talking about. Okay, there is a big gap. Okay, and as Asim was telling me, via what Kundu sir told him, that none of the developers have come forward to participate in the scheme, particularly because the interest of the developers, the imagination of the governments doesn't tally with what is happening on the ground. And if you look at land, okay, the land question, which they constantly say land is lying around. Why is this land lying around? Because of the land banks. And it is through land banks, each developer not only makes the killing, their power within the industry comes from that. When DLF collapsed, nearly collapsed in 3 years back, and in an interview with the American, one of the PricewaterhouseCoopers, when they were asked, what do you think, will DLF go? Said no. DLF holds 3,600 acres in Gurgaon, and there is no way any other developer will enter. Do you think DLF is holding on to this money to release part of it for low income housing? They are basically holding on to this money because today, in your assessment of your company, land is a liquid capital. It's treated as a liquid gold. So to understand the larger politics of rental housing, to what extent it will serve the interest of lower income people, you also have to situate the situation, how developers play the land and financial market, and how do these policies speak to that developer's interest. And finally, I also say, if land is that story, now, if you look at, I told you in the rental housing production, two things are critical. One is land and one is finance. Okay, where is this finance going to come from? It's institutional investment, and that is where, if you look at carefully, there is this word called real estate investment trust. Okay, and the real estate what are these real estate investment trusts? These are registered companies. They are going to own and they operate the real estate to generate an income. You and I, as small investors, if we want to invest in a project for a dormitory construction, no investor will think twice for investing in such a project, assuming we are such philanthropists and we are investing. Then the corporation will manage the The corporation will manage the property for you. They are not going to give you rent. They are going to give you dividends. They are going to give you income at the end of the year, depending on the income that they are generating from rents. Why so? Because housing markets are fluctuating markets, whether you cater for low income or higher income or middle income. Who is going to bear the risk, right? And real estate investment trusts are not going to bear the risk at all. And that means real estate corporations often try and manage high value real estate property. When I told you, when you think of real estate investment trust, think of Jared Kushner and think of the gentrification that happened in Manhattan. Real estate investment trust, by the very logic of how they manage the surplus, how they generate the surplus, is geared towards a particular market where they can accumulate surplus. Yeah. So essentially, in this game, as a shareholder, I might lose if the market collapses. And the lower income group, their opportunities are foreclosed. They are losing. Now, there is this institutional investors who are constantly being saved. And this idea of real estate investment trust also comes in because if you look at the kind of control they have on the economy, in United States, they own $3 trillion worth of real estate assets. And most of these assets have come out of pushing out lower income tenants and retrofitting these buildings for luxury apartments. And investments are mobilized through equity and mortgage, and it's very clear who will invest. You want an income, but you don't want to own an asset, because owning a house and selling a house, if you really know it, it's a game in itself. It doesn't mean just because you own a house of 12 lakhs, you can realize that 12 lakhs in capital. There is the market operates in a very different way. So a lot of us may not want to invest. This is an investment. And that is reflected in the rental housing policy. Rental housing as an investment. It is not talking about rental housing as a welfare, rental housing as a distribution. And it is why the developers come in. If you look at the India's first RIED, it was promoted by Embassy Office Park, which is a Bangalore-based developer. And they were backed by Blackstone Group. The Blackstone Group is a global private equity. Now, think of the strategy that is outlined for production of urban housing, rental housing, and think of the target group that they are mentioning in their operational guideline. See the big gap. Why would this group ever, will this group ever cater to this market that they are talking about, the destitute, the homeless, the migrants? And if their whole bread, butter, jam, and cake is coming out of banking on land, banking on playing the financial market, okay, what they do transfer to the lower income group in the form of rental housing is the risk, or the risk of foreclosure, or the risk of being displaced from that area. Now, yes, I made another argument. Why is it that these developers are going after? Because if real estate development collapses in this country, it also puts a lot of banks under danger, and that means it destabilizes our financial system as a whole. So basically, the government at one level is compelled to save these developers, and that is where I argue that rental housing policy that they've come out is basically an extension of their larger corporate-led development, and currently it's a mechanism to rescue the developers, and the interest of the low-income residents are sacrificed in this process. I end my presentation here.
Yeah, thank you, Bhuvna. Just could you mind just closing your screen, the PowerPoint?
Stop share.
Stop share. Yeah. Thank you, Bhuvna. We started from rental housing, but that was a very comprehensive framework of the political economy of land, finances, and urban development. So thank you so much for that. May I just open wherever possible now, whoever is not on the phone or have a better bandwidth, they may switch on their videos. And may I just open the house for discussion? Any questions, clarifications, or any? Am I audible to everybody?
Yeah. So let me break the silence. Actually, I was hoping that a student will ask the question, but first of all, thank you. It's always fascinating to listen you. So yeah, there is one question from Asmita. First, let's, sir, can we take that question first?
Yes. Arvind, why don't you coordinate it?
Yeah, so basically, Asmita wants to know about looking at Hong Kong public housing rental policy. It faces various issues like a flat seeker being on the wait list for a minimum of 5 years, due to which many of the seekers end up living in a squatter condition. Additionally, in recent year, the government has prioritized economic benefits rather than meet citizens' demand. So the shortage of land and capitalization of housing is termed nothing sort of a crisis now. Is
Why
India
don't you
also?
ask it, Asmita, why don't you go ahead and ask instead of...
Yeah, the precise question, yes.
Ma'am, I just want to ask that we see that in Hong Kong, even right now, they have a rental policy. But in Hong Kong, the issue is that there's shortage of land, and now the government has started capitalizing because of that public housing rental policy. Do you think that India might face the same crisis because of all of this, because of the same path we're walking on?
Okay. Okay, India is still not. Thank you for that question. Hong Kong is a classic example of the seven twelves who control the entire island, who even own island outside Hong Kong, right? And the connection between the developer and the Chinese Communist Party, as well as the Hong Kong, the ruling party, the current ruling party of Hong Kong, is very, very, very close, right? And that kind of tilts yes, Hong Kong has a natural disadvantage because it's an island. There's only so much you can reclaim the land. This, together with the fact that that these groups, you are from Hong Kong, is it?
No, ma'am, I'm from India itself.
Okay, in Hong Kong, this, together with the fact how they play the release of land, okay, is one reason why it contributed to very high prices, and it also pushed the tenure from ownership tenure to rental tenure, right? Rather than giving ownership, they went into renting. I say this also because you will see, if you go towards Hong Kong, particularly if you travel from Hong Kong into Shenzhen, you can take the train, right? And if you come to this place called New Towns, the New Town territory, and on a Sunday, if you travel there, you see this entire migrants from Hong Kong moving into New Town to the mall, right? And from the other side, you see from Shanghai, because Hong Kong in the new territory, the river separates Shanghai and this side. You will see people from Shanghai coming into the new territory to buy baby food, right? You will find all these groups congregating. Now, if you look at the land in the new territory, it is governed by a very different system, because that's the only place where you have lots of green open space. That is where they are opening up for a lot of new developments, also including settling people. That's a bit of a no man's land. And because of the variety of reasons, the way the British relationship and the expats, people who moved out of Hong Kong and how they hold land, a lot of these, and also the clans that occupy this new territory, they have a customary forms of regulation. So it's very difficult for a developer to poach into that land. Okay, it's possible only if the village gets into village committee gets into an agreement with it. And so if you go to new territory, you will find these patches. Some places they have managed to build these huge towers, high-rise income development. So what is left? What is left and what is easier for them to play is the inner city model. Okay? A lot of the inner city development, you must read this person work. He's Vincent Tank, okay, who writes a lot on Hong Kong. And you should also read Alan Smart's work on how Hong Kong's land get released. Okay? A lot of this squatter land was released through fires. hires a common way, you release the land into development. And then what do? Then you shift the tenure from ownership to rental. So the way you have framed the question, which is where can be inflected in such a way, it's not that renting becomes a solution for ownership. It is also a constructed scarcity that paves way for a certain group to benefit. Yes, Hong Kong, if I see Bombay, every time I go to Hong Kong and see in this 3x3 room, I imagine Bombay might one day become like that. It's possible. But I also feel the Indian politics is a bit more complicated. It's a bit more complicated, and I don't see it that easily cleaned, because even the large developers, despite all their need and their legal framework supporting them, the land policy supporting them, they have not been able to erase the medium and small developers from the ground. There is always this messy local politics operating at different scales. I see there the intersection of caste politics, class politics, and the way ethnic groups hold the land ownership patterns in this country would render it rather difficult for governments for an easy clean over of the territory. But I don't see, that doesn't mean it's not possible. Look at what has happened with with COVID. COVID was enough to bring all of us into all kind of surveillance. Yes, we have to see that the political space is kind of robust, and it's not only about social movements. And I think it's also in the way we generate knowledge and we look and analyze these issues and put it in the public domain.
Thank you, ma'am.
Any other question?
Hello, ma'am.
Hi.
Yeah, I have a
Hi.
question.
Yes,
Rajita.
please.
So, hi, ma'am. Yeah. Actually, I have worked in Delhi in Katputli colony, like you talked about, and which is completely like they were uprooted, and how people have moved to Anand Parvat and Bhavana, like as you discussed about it. So what I want to ask, when government they try to give this in situ rehabilitation kind of policy, like which is there in Delhi Development Plan 2021. So how should we weigh it? Because according to them, they are not completely displacing those people out of the city, but after some time there is some percentage, I guess 30 to 40% of the development which will be done in that land. So people will be provided home who has been shifted. But yes, I understand how 2,500 plus households were shifted, because I was there on the field for 2 months, like in that colony. So I can understand what that colony was, and I also live just next to that colony. So this is how I wanted to understand. How should we understand like the intention or the intention of the government and the private sector when they say that they will provide in situ rehabilitation? Yes, ma'am.
Okay, my answer to your question is, you're familiar with the Katputli colony and you're familiar with the conflict that went on, right? And if you follow the trajectory of the conflict, it went on from 2012 till 2017. That is when they could move them, right? What was the conflict? One of the fundamental disagreement that Katputli colony people had was, you talked about in situ upgradation, right? What is in situ upgradation? That means you are going to regularize our land as a spare basis, and you're going to give it to us. Okay? That is the first contention. And the contention came also because they were never told what the plan is. They were never told that there is a developer involved and that there is going to be this land share, and the land share is going to be 40:60. Okay, that is when they really felt cheated. They said, you're taking 60% of our land and you're giving the developer, and you're squeezing all of us in 40%. And why so? Because if you look at the history of housing policy intervention in Katputli, that was a third plan. You had Rajiv Sethi coming up with this idea of artist colony, HUDCO coming in and saying, okay, we are going to do it. Then HUDCO backing out and saying, no, we are not doing it. We are going to have a tenement. Then VP Singh giving the parchi and saying, no, you will get your plot. Then again, coming back and saying, no, we are going to do tenement. Then comes 2012 Rakeja and says, no, you're not doing it. This is from the people's end. Why did they want land? They saw land, and it comes out in their expression. If you must be familiar with the artisan group, and you would have also seen the way they work with their okay, Katputli colony, for the rest of you, is a squatter settlement that happened in Delhi, and as the name Katputli suggests, it's an artisans colony, and one group of artisans are involved in puppet making. Okay, and this puppet is also very large. It's supported on large stilts. Some of these puppets are 6 feet tall. Okay, around this puppetry, they also have other folk arts like magic, that music, and then you have other community. This is a group that came from Rajasthan, and with the support of one of the Delhi's leading artists, settled on that land. And because the land is located next to Okla, you had migrants, industrial laborers settling there. You also had a tribal group from Andhra Pradesh involved in traditional medicine settling there. So in short, Katputli colony over the years became a home to very heterogeneous migrant groups. Okay? But because the name is Katputli, the identity of the colony came to be very closely linked to the identity of puppeteers. But the interests are many there. All of them, for various reasons, they all wanted a house, right? And they all wanted independent plots. None of them wanted tenements. Okay. The dominant groups, who at least the communities that were very leading the struggle, they had an interest in plots because of their work, and they saw their house as an extension of their work. And this is where this early housing literature used to teach us. Housing is not just about some 4 walls and a room, and in any location. Location is critical. And Katputli colony people constantly will tell you, we need this location for our security. We come back at a very late time, and this locality is important for us. This locality is also important for us because of the networks we have made. Because you're not going to get puppetry every time. Okay, that is the second thing. So housing has a broader meaning. You have to understand housing as a verb, as John Turner, one of the famous housing theorists, used to insist. But the way it gets translated in our government policies is accounting. I build a unit somewhere, I tick the box. Your housing needs are met. Not really. And then we get into this. The housing, precisely the conflict started from there. But why Katputli colony was selected for in situ upgradation? If you, Rajiv Awas Yojana kind of proudly announced that we are going to do in situ upgradation. But how many squatter settlements did they choose for in situ upgradation? 3. And if you look at the resettlements, they had a list of 96. Almost most of Delhi's squatter settlement, their plan was resettlement. Why 3? And where was this 3 located? All were prime real estate location, and developers were interested in it. And in fact, if you look at the tendering process, if you look at how this project originated and who were the architects involved, Rakeja was a main lobbyist, and he was a main driver of this project, right? And why was Rakeja interested in the project? Not because Katputli's 5-acre land. There was a larger game. That particular plot was falling along the transport corridor. And the idea for developing the transport corridor is based on tapping the real estate value gains of land. It's called the land-based financing. How do you do it? Precisely, I take you back to Hong Kong model. Okay, basically you can see it in any European countries or Hong Kong. You build a kind of you build a thing. You build a metro station, and you have a mall around it, around which you around which you can generate your finances. Around which you generate your finances. So it's basically the larger gain that you can have around land. That is what is led to the Rakeja's interest in that model. And that's why I'm again seeing, you can't see it as Katputli colony. You can't see the low income income rental policies without situating it within the larger political economy of urban development. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.
Good evening, ma'am. This is Sudhanshu.
Yeah. Yeah.
Actually, ma'am, I have 4 questions that I was thinking about. Should I just list out 4 of them, or should we go one by one?
Maybe one by one, that would be better.
Okay, ma'am. Ma'am, the first one is, as we know, housing is a state subject, and many states have regressive rent control laws that still exist, which discourages rental housing. So, how viable is the central government policies on rental housing?
How viable is the central government policies for state housing? Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Yes, you're right that it is a state subject, and the reason it got moved into the center's hand is because of financing. Okay. If you look at various models for housing, the state, whether it's the local government or the urban local government, the finances is finished. So the state governments are also depending on centralized schemes for building the houses, right? And that is where this whole private sector, let's get the private sector, let's get the foreign direct investment, all of these ideas also came in. Yeah. The thing with central government schemes is they come with a conditionality. And that is what constrained the state government from responding to the needs that they are facing on the ground. Okay, whether it's the everywhere there's local politics. Okay, and we know how poor people are not sitting there waiting for you to come. They are also trying to build the pressure against projects that are not in their interest. And if you look at whether it is politicians or whether it is the bureaucrats, not all of them are good or bad. There are bureaucrats who are also inspired by this ideal to serve society. You look at all IAS officers. But one thing that constrains that hand is the conditionalities that is coming up with all of these centralized schemes. So partly the failure of Ray Ray was never so successful in Bangalore. It got implemented as BSUP. Basically, Ray's latest incarnation of various other earlier schemes, right? And essentially, the point that I wanted to make is that central government schemes constrain state governments, but they are not able to respond to the need. They are not able to maneuver their way, partly because of the condition. Partly because of their dependence on central government for their finances. On the ground, many of these projects are messy. They remain incomplete. If you want to go to Bangalore, you can look at the Lageri case, case. And yes, you can say state subject and central subject, but finance can always be used as a tool of control. And that is what is happening with this, increasingly is happening with urban development policies. It's through finance that the central government controls the actions of the state and the local government. And of course, all these conditionalities are backed by consultancy reports. So they are not coming from out of the minds of some bureaucrats or technical planners. Essentially, there is a lobby at work. Today, if you see where is policy being made, it's made in McKinsey and Knight and Frank and Blackstone, particularly urban development policies. And it's pretty much the same. You see the smart city for Hong Kong, see the smart city plan for India. See everywhere, it's the same cut, copy, paste.
Ma'am, the second question was, there are many studies which states that the rental housing stocks are generally of low quality. Would it be enough if the government introduced 2 drafts pending in the parliament, that is the National Urban Rental Housing and the Model Tenancy, when we know that the quality of the houses are not at par with the ownership-based housing?
Yeah. I didn't get your question. Can I ask it?
Actually, ma'am, there are a lot of studies that states that the rental housing unit stocks are of low quality. So would it be enough if the government passes the 2 bills that are pending in the parliament? The first one is the National Urban Rental Housing and the Model Tenancy Act.
Not really. You saw the National Urban Rental Housing, right?
Yes.
The interest is clear. The interest is clear. And what the Model Tenancy Act is going to do is pretty much bring everybody into the regulatory, in their version of regulatory framework. Beyond that, I don't think it's going to serve any larger interest. Yeah.
And the third one is in India, where there is a lot of diversity and discrimination.
Yes.
So do you think it would be viable, because many landowners prefer to give out rental units to people belonging to their own community, which actually restricts?
It's not. It reinforces it. And your policy is not going to add on to it, because you look at how developers get their land. Land markets does not work like your pen market or your other commodity markets, right? Where your demand and supply will define the price. Land is very tricky. You define the price of the land by who owns it. What are the conflicts within that on that particular land? You see a lot of calculation. I give you an example. In Sonipat, where I used to teach, there used to be, when I came in 2012, there was this very large plot of land abutting the main road. It was a main land. Okay, it, according to paper value, it could be sold for crores of rupees. Okay? Now, one particular developer was interested in that land, and the landowner was not willing to do. One rumor that was said that there is going to be a sewage pumping station in this plot killed this market. Till today, he is not able to sell his land. So land works in very different way, land transaction. So most developers, they do it through their ethnic networks. You see DLF, how did they assemble that kind of land in Gurgaon? It goes through the ethnic network. So already the way the market works is reinforcing existing caste and ethnic inequalities, right? And your rental housing via this private sector development is not going to even it out. Basically, it's going to reinforce it, right? And that is where I feel whether Dravidian parties today might not be the original progressive party, but their idea of redistributing through public housing and with a specific anti-caste agenda did serve some purpose, did alter the housing ownership pattern, alter the land ownership pattern, particularly in parts of Tanjavur, which is a rich agricultural belt in Tamil Nadu. And that kind of movement politics, symbiosis, and speaking to each other is necessary. I don't think these policies in itself and the way the status quo, the way things are working is going to matter. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. Actually, the other question you answered in your first question is.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
So there are a few questions in the chat box also, both from our faculty only. So how do you see this? Because the story of SEZ in India is largely resulted into the land grabbing by all these real estate developers. Okay.
Yes.
Lately, it has been found that these land parcels are vacant, and largely it attracted to the real estate developers also. So what do you think? What kind of institutional changes do you think we should have to regulate the real estate market to have the to grab these lands? And also the second question is related to tenure security of slum dwellers. How it helps the slum dwellers in upgrading their houses, existing houses, and how this policy change the existing housing market in urban India?
Okay, I'll take the second question first. Like, for example, in situ regularization in its original meaning had been implemented. It's implemented both through large schemes like citywide schemes, as in the case of Chennai's Urban Development Project 1 and 2, as well as through everyday politics, right? People try to consolidate their houses. Look at all of us. None of our tenure or title is really clear in this country. Okay, but how do we manage to do it? We kind of accumulate as many evidence as possible. We get our names into the property register. We get our names into the infrastructure. And a similar strategy is used by poorer groups to claim land via adverse possession. And here they tap into a number of welfare schemes for free land and free housing. As well as when they regularize, they go for, if you look at the acts provide for incremental regularization. The moment you say, let's have tithing, then it opens up into a big conflict. If you look at the Slum Clearance Act, intelligent politicians have always used it. There have been examples both in Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, where you incrementally extend infrastructure and you consolidate. You make the situation difficult for the government, concerned agency to evict you because there is investment that's gone in. Then you slowly start reworking the papers, and that's how the regularization process works in most cases. And this, in fact, was told to me by one of the standing committee members of the corporation. It's not something that I discovered. It's something that these experienced politicians have been playing using the opportunities available within the local government process, within the laws, etc. Now, the contestation that is coming now is to close all these opportunities, like the developers bill, okay? Because you've already constructed the image that all politicians are corrupt and you cannot depend on them. You have to have bureaucracy. You have to have this policy. It reminds you of Francia's policy as policing. We have reached that state. We use policing to order, but to order in the interest of the larger groups. So if you look at that, I think now with the housing crisis, everybody is now talking about in situ regularization. I feel it's possible that the push comes to take it back. But people are incrementally consolidating their status. Yeah. Okay. Once again. And in terms of SEZ, I don't know. That policy is like morphed into industrial corridors and it's morphed into smart cities, right? Fundamentally, unless we rethink of urban development, as it stands now, the scale of grabbing is going to increase. Yeah. Asim?
Yeah, very last question, ma'am. Actually, if we see the trajectory of urban development in India, we started from creating various institutions. Yeah. And maybe the purpose was very pious, but if you see the reflection, like we have created Development Authority for resolving the housing issue in India. Likewise, we have adopted the master planning approach. But lately it has found that rather than the implementation of all these regulations and policies, the policy itself is very flawed. And the crisis which we are facing in terms of housing also, it is largely reflected in the policy, the formulation of the policy itself. So how do you think that the failure is mainly in the policy itself, the formulation of the policy itself?
Okay, I see policy as politics, right? I go by, I draw Benjamin's occupancy urbanism thesis here. And basically, it's like, if you look at all of us, right? All of us are pushing our interest, right? And who's able to get down to the negotiating table? And the master planning experience throughout in different parts of this world is precisely that. That basically you constantly mobilize various weapons that is within your hand, of which the state laws, shaping the laws is one important lesson. So this policy formulation as a flaw is a very generous statement. It's a deliberate flaw. It's a deliberate thing that you're capturing the ground, right? Now, what is the counter politics that you're having? Okay, and that also lies in institutional design. Parastatals are not simply innocent creations. If you look at the history of parastatals, whether in the UK, or you look at why parastatals were created in the Chennai's case, they were very clear. They want to cut out one particular, they called it as political interference, right? And the planners were very clear when they created the Chennai MMDA and they created this Urban Development Authority, and then they moved on to create an infrastructure financing corporation. It is all about how do you make decisions? How do you corner the decision-making process? So I think if we have to rethink, we have to relook at the institutional design. Relook at the institutional design where the so-called political interference can also play out. Because that political interference reflects a counter view, right? And so I still think a lot of the democratic institutions like the municipal government, the processes that they have to be reclaimed. And now easily this idea is constructed, all local governments are a bad one, all councillors are a bad one, let's have everything controlled within bureaucracy. And that is dangerous because the bureaucracy also represents a particular social interest. We need to really balance the power within our institutions.
Yeah.
Can I just...
Yes, sir, go ahead.
Bhuvna, just a minor comment and just seek your opinion on that rather. See, when you talk about access to housing, access to various entitlements which citizens are not able to get in a market society.
Yeah.
Is it possible to think of even these entitlements or access or whatever you might term it as, whether I don't know whether I can term right or not, without any access to employment?
No, you can't. Housing is very much linked to both your shelter plus your work. And that was precisely the fight of Kathputli colony people. Work, it is the location. It's a location. Housing is all about the location, the place, and what the networks that the place is going to give you. All of this is all linked to how you find your work in this city and how you're going to stabilize your work. Housing has a broader meaning, and the problem is the reduction of housing to a room, to a bathroom. That is where we started falling apart.
Yeah, that's what
So ma'am, this current migrant, because see, we are talking all this new policy approach, like the rental housing, the discussion all of a sudden is very popular. And if I look at, we have passed Interstate Migrant Workmen Act 1979, which clearly says that if you are hiring more than 5 migrant workers, you have to provide the suitable residential accommodation. This is in regulation. This is in law.
Okay. Yeah.
But largely, if you see, it has never been implemented.
Okay.
So if you see I find that previously, if you see the sugarcane industry, it has generally, when an industrialist acquire land to establish sugarcane industry, they also acquire land to make makeshift arrangement at least for the seasonal migrant workers, and this is very popular in Maharashtra and most of the cases in UP also. But that is invisible in the current context, where the employer is totally absent from provisioning of the housing when it comes to the migrant workers. So how do you see this thing?
Totally. It's actually construction work. You take it. They are supposed to provide housing, right? But basically, they're getting away with it. Yeah. It's also because of the way they work, and also the way economy is organized has also changed, right? You think of the older models of Tata factory or Titan factory. The employers, the idea of that capitalism is very different, right? They also, Ford, for example, is a classic example, where they saw that the benefit to capitalism is that labor lives well. So without the labor having that extra money to buy their product, they go nowhere, right? But that thing is gone now. This is now accumulation for accumulation. I seriously think that it's not just about policy alone. These are larger questions which we have to address through politics also, and by deepening the political sphere. It's an answer in abstract, but it's also not, the solutions are not also in terms of concrete terms, right? Yeah.
Is there any other question from our student side?
I think you should let Bhuvna rest.
Yeah. Okay. No, it's fine. So it's always fascinating to listen, Bhuvna ma'am, and obviously I, like, as a student of urban studies, I regularly just keep following her writing, and I request all of my students also, they must follow her writing also, and you'll get.
I mean, just to Bhuvna, I just want to share with you that in though overall the intellectual framework of the school is the same as your school, but we have three different concentrations.
Yes.
Social conflict, regulation, and urbanization.
Yeah.
So one of the Arvind leads the urbanization thing, and this year he's running a research program on informal settlements.
Okay.
Okay, so just so we have the school itself has a lot of interest in urbanization. That's why I just wanted to share.
That's interesting. Anant is there, right?
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so we will keep reading your writings, and which largely reflect, and as if one could go from the very first slide, various topics we have covered, from the land issue, we have covered the finance issue, we have covered the planning approach, planning issue itself, then various stakeholders, various different actors which play a very important role when it comes to the housing, urban housing markets. So one could not enrich her or his knowledge just by just mere attending the half an hour. We could have gone through an array of things which we could simply miss from reading an article or something like that. Means we have touched in situ development, most of the aspects which one should learn once one is studying urban housing market, especially in context of not only India, in developing countries context in general. So I would like to sincerely convey my gratitude on the behalf of the school itself for just giving this opportunity to listen you, and we hope that in future also you will oblige us in the same fashion.
No, thank you so much. No, thank you so much. It was also an opportunity for me to relook at a lot of things. Yeah, thank you so much, and thanks to all of you for listening to my rambling for 1 hour with such patience. Thanks again.
Yeah, and I would
thank
you.
Yeah. Lastly, I would like to thank my prospective team also, who is always very helpful at the very last moment, and all the students for patiently listening all these things, raising pertinent questions. So thank you all. Yeah.
Right. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Sasi.
Bye.
Yeah,
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye. You can leave by, there's this button on the right. Yeah, I think she has been able to.
Ifshita, you are there?
Yeah, I'm there.
I'm removing them so we can just talk.
अश्विन सर हम एंड कर देंगे सर.
हमको होस्ट बना दीजिए, जाइए आप, हम बंद कर देंगे. ठीक है.
ओके.
रिकॉर्डिंग रोक दिए ना.
अभी रोक रहे सर, एक मिनट.
अरे सब तो, अरे ये रोका नहीं है.